9. Disgruntled DoorDash driver. While picking up a DoorDash order at a Chick-fil-A restaurant in Philadelphia one day in mid-2022, a driver became enraged over a missing milkshake. He demanded that another one be made, but an employee insisted that the order had only asked for one milkshake, not two. By then, the man was sitting in his car with his handgun in his lap. He refused to show the employees his receipt to prove that there were two milkshakes in the order, and a team supervisor asked him to give the order back. However, the man refused, and once again he demanded a second milkshake. At that point, the manager had come outside, and they told the supervisor to go back into the restaurant. The disgruntled DoorDasher sped off, but returned to the restaurant a little while later and opened fire through the front door, striking an employee in the leg. Luckily, the worker survived, and police quickly caught up with the suspect. He has yet to be formally charged, but he was taken into custody on suspicion of being the shooter. Speaking to reporters, Police Captain John Walker expressed frustration that the young workers dealt with violence for doing the right thing and doing their jobs properly. He said that he believes the suspect needs to be taken off the street and to receive the highest sentence and bail amount possible. The suspect denied that he was involved in the incident, despite matching employees' description of having a specific tattoo on his neck. At the moment, the case is ongoing. 8. Hugh Hootman. A petty dispute that eventually led to murder began in 2022, when an elderly woman named Susan Hootman propped open the laundry door at her apartment complex in Stuart, Florida. Her neighbor, 81-year-old Henry Wallace, had a problem with this and other things that he felt violated proper laundry room etiquette. Henry lashed out at Susan, leaving her feeling shaken and upset. A few days later, Susan's husband Hugh Hootman encountered Henry and expressed his disapproval of how he handled the situation with his wife. He demanded that Henry apologize to Susan, but he ignored Hugh and tried walking away. This was when Hugh allegedly pulled out his 9mm pistol and fatally shot Henry, whose wife Ginger rushed out of the apartment upon hearing the gunshots. Ginger was shot twice. She also died from her injuries. After senselessly killing his neighbors, Hugh entered his apartment and instructed Susan to dial 911, but a mailman had already beaten them to it. When responding deputies arrived, Hugh admitted to shooting the Wallaces and said he lost his temper. He apologized and said he wished he could take it back. But unfortunately, he can't, and now he's facing 2 charges of first-degree murder for his crimes. 7. Yaqub Salik Talib. Former NFL cornerback Aqib Talib and his brother, 39-year-old Yaqub Salik Talib, were at a youth football game in Lancaster, Texas in 2022, when an argument broke out between the coaching staffs of the 2 opposing teams. They disagreed over some calls that were made by officials, and the tensions quickly escalated to the point where the game was called off. Shortly after that, Yaqub allegedly pulled out a semi-automatic handgun and shot 43-year-old coach Michael Hickman multiple times. Police arrived to find Hickman on the ground with fatal gunshot wounds to his chest, back, and forearm. By then, Yaqub had already fled the scene in an unidentified vehicle. The children who witnessed the violence were reportedly put into counseling to help them deal with their trauma. Yaqub ended up turning himself in and is now facing a murder charge. His attorney, Clark Birdsall, told the New York Times shortly after Yaqub's arrest that he'd interviewed several witnesses and believes that Hickman instigated the deadly disagreement. Birdsall claimed that his client acted in self-defense and in defense of innocent bystanders. Yaqub's brother, former pro football player Aqib Talib, released a statement through his attorney saying that he was devastated by the tragic loss of life. Sadly, the incident highlights a worsening trend of adults resorting to violence to resolve disputes over youth sports. 6. Benjamin Lopez. In 2017, a petty dispute over marijuana erupted into unhinged violence that resulted in the senseless death of a grandmother in Long Island, New York. It all started when 23-year-old Benjamin Lopez blamed a man he was doing business with, 24-year-old Mark Depperman, for some drug deals that had apparently gone bad. To get what they felt was owed to them, Lopez and a co-conspirator, D'Angelo Gill, sat outside the Depperman's house in Levittown, where he lived with his grandmother. The disgruntled dealers waited until Depperman's grandmother was home alone before entering the house armed with a machete. They beat and hacked 73-year-old Lorraine Pizzicemi to death. Sadly, she was already fighting cancer at the time of her murder. The intruders were scavenging the home for valuables a little while later when Depperman returned home. Lopez and his accomplice attacked the young man with a knife, but he managed to secretly dial 911. He survived the attack, but lost the use of his left hand. When police arrived, the suspects attempted to flee on foot out the back door. They ran to Lopez's home just a few blocks away and were quickly apprehended by the police. Authorities charged Lopez and 19-year-old D'Angelo Gill with second-degree murder. Gill pleaded guilty to the charge in 2019 and was sentenced to 17 years to life in prison. Lopez's case dragged on in court for 5 years due to ongoing issues over his mental status. According to prosecutors, Lopez claimed he was mentally ill but refused to submit to any sort of testing or treatment. His defense lawyer claimed that he had a lifelong history of psychosis and refusing treatment. He implied that the court system is unfortunately ill-equipped to deal with these types of mental health situations. However, the prosecution saw Lopez's behavior as a delaying tactic and maintained that he acted with intent and knew the difference between right and wrong when he murdered Pizzicemi. Lopez was ultimately convicted of murder in 2022 and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He refused to enter the courtroom on the day of his sentencing and had to be brought in on a wheelchair. During the hearing, he lashed out into a bizarre, rambling monologue, stating that he didn't consent to the sentencing. The judge replied that the defendant's consent wasn't necessary and brought the case to a longer-awaited end. In a statement, Pizzicemi's friends and family wish Lopez many hellish years on earth while he rots behind bars. The victim's son-in-law, Thomas Dorser, told reporters that after years of delays, the family was more than glad that the court process was finally over with. 5. Sarah Nicole Morales and Andrew Durr. 35-year-old librarian Sarah Nicole Morales was 5 months pregnant when she rammed her car into a motorcycle during a road rage altercation in Orange City, Florida in 2021. She fled the scene while the victim, Andrew Durr, and several other motorists followed her to prevent her from escaping. At one point, they warned Morales against turning at an intersection and advised her to wait until the police arrived. However, she ignored them and turned anyway, so the pursuit continued until Morales arrived at her home and went inside. Durr and the other witnesses remained outside her residence and called 911. Meanwhile, Morales also called the police and said aggressive men were threatening her. She was still on the line with the dispatcher when she walked outside with a handgun and ordered the witnesses to leave her property. Fearing for his life, Durr pulled out his own handgun and fired multiple shots at Morales. The woman died from her injuries and sadly, the baby didn't make it. Durr was handcuffed at the scene and taken into custody, but cooperated with law enforcement. An investigation concluded he acted legitimately in self-defense, and authorities declined to press charges against him. 4. Russell Jones. 62-year-old Russell Jones got into a heated argument with his elderly neighbor, Robert Burns, in 2022 over some garbage that was blocking a parking space outside their homes in Liverpool, England. Jones was deeply offended because Robert's wife allegedly called him a weirdo, and he apparently brewed about it for months before the men came face to face once more. Burns and his wife Wendy were walking past when they saw Jones pounding his fist against his own vehicle while yelling, "Glass houses, glass houses." They weren't exactly sure what he meant, but they ignored him in hopes of avoiding another hostile encounter. A few months later, Jones drove up to the couple before getting out of the car and shouting at them. Once again, his statements made no sense. Concerned for Wendy's safety, Burns told Jones to back off several times. Instead of complying, Jones grabbed Wendy's arm and Burns sprang into action to protect her. The men exchanged blows and Burns fell to the ground as Jones ruthlessly continued to pummel him. In the meantime, Wendy pleaded with Jones to stop beating her husband, who said she was frail and sick. She screamed for help as Burns lay helpless on the sidewalk, unable to fight back or get up. A passerby eventually pulled Jones off of his victim and he was arrested for assault. He maintained his innocence in court and denied that he attacked Burns, but was ultimately convicted of the charge. It's unclear whether he's been sentenced or if he faces jail time. 3. Michael Roberts and Andrew Carrack-Sonyi. Neighbors Michael Roberts and Andrew Carrack-Sonyi were both in their 60s when they lived next door to each other in Stuart, Florida. But their age didn't stop them from handling their petty disagreements in the least mature way possible, letting their differences escalate into deadly violence. Over time, the two established a long history of calling the police on each other with allegations of vandalism, racism, threats, poisoning, and slashing car tires. While arriving home on January 29, 2022, Roberts saw Carrack-Sonyi standing by his mailbox, and he was allegedly moving his finger across his neck in a threatening way. When Roberts opened his front door, his dog rushed out, and Carrack-Sonyi sprayed the dog with bug spray. Roberts rushed toward the dog and also received a face full of insecticide. He apparently fell to the ground while Carrack-Sonyi stood over him and taunted him. Believing he had been fatally poisoned, Roberts pulled out his gun and shot his neighbor. There was no camera on the property, so investigators were tasked with relying on other evidence, including documents of past encounters gone wrong, to learn the truth behind the shooting. They ultimately determined that Roberts had reason to fear for his life when he shot Carrack-Sonyi, even though bug spray is just a mild irritant. The state attorney overseeing the case ruled that based on past incidents, Roberts was justified in his belief that his neighbor was unstable and dangerous. In the end, authorities declined to press charges and instead closed the case. 2. Deshaun Longmire. In late June 2022, Pastor Ronald Mouton Sr. pulled up to a red light in the Houston, Texas area and got into a disagreement with the driver of a car stopped in the lane next to his. At one point, the two cars started moving, but they stopped next to each other again and continued the argument. Witnesses would later describe seeing the other driver raising a handgun toward Mouton and pulling the trigger. Mouton ended up losing control of his BMW due to his injuries and crashed. Unfortunately, he was pronounced dead at the scene. The 58-year-old left behind 4 kids, 10 grandchildren, and a church congregation that admired and looked up to him dearly. The alleged shooter, Deshaun Longmire, fled the scene, but he was charged with murder several weeks later. Longmire, who drove for Uber at the time, reportedly told investigators he wasn't in the area at the time of the shooting, but Uber records proved otherwise. Thankfully, Longmire didn't have a passenger in his car at the time of the incident. Investigators found no connection between Longmire and Mouton, and they believe that the shooting stemmed purely from a road rage dispute. At the moment, the case is ongoing. 1. David Berry. When 44-year-old David Berry found a landscaping truck partially blocking the driveway at his Clearwater, Florida home in early July 2022, he was filled with rage. Surveillance footage shows that he likely had enough room to back his truck out of the driveway, but to Berry, it was unacceptable for the vehicle to be even slightly in his way. And instead of confronting the landscaper in a composed fashion, Berry began screaming and yelling at the man, who was working in a yard nearby. According to witnesses and video evidence, Berry retrieved a semi-automatic rifle from his truck and pointed it at the landscaper while threatening to shoot him. Florida's laws and culture are very pro-gun, so the bystanders who witnessed the outburst weren't expecting the police to charge Berry with any crimes. But they did, and Berry is now facing a felony charge of aggravated assault. His guns have also been taken away while the case works its way through the court system. In a statement, Clearwater Police Chief Dan Slaughter said there's no reason for someone to arm themselves with an assault rifle and threaten another person over something so trivial. It shows that even in places where people tend to be gung-ho about their gun rights, it's still possible to take things too far. Would you rather have your flight diverted due to an unruly drunk passenger who lashed out at the staff for refusing to serve them more alcohol? Or have a family member who verbally abuses restaurant servers every time you go out to dinner together? Let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.